I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Physicians can learn a lot from talking to patients, and not just from the words they say, but from millions of data points from acoustic features of their speech, such as pitch, vocal cord vibration patterns, and micro-instabilities in the voice. Canary Speech has developed an AI-based diagnostic listening tool that can detect neurological and psychiatric conditions from physiological signals in the voice. We spoke to Kang Hsu, Chief Medical Officer of Canary Speech, about how its diagnostic tool works, how it's embedded invisibly into clinical workflows, and how the company is driving physician adoption. Kang, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about diagnosing mental health and cognitive conditions, Canary Speech, and its use of a person's voice for early disease detection. Let's start with mental health conditions like anxiety and depression and neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease. How are these generally diagnosed, and what's the challenge with diagnosing them today, particularly at the earliest stages?
Yeah, great question. So I probably separate the two types of diseases here. So for anxiety and depression, these are probably best diagnosed using a combination of validated screening tools. So you may have heard of the PHQ-9 for depression or the GAD-7 for anxiety. So you could use those to screen a patient when you're talking to them. Of course, that takes some time to do. You'd also obviously want to do an interview with the patient, look at like the DSM-5 manual, right? And then you'd also want to do certain tests just to rule out other medical conditions that might mimic, say, depression or anxiety. So like blood tests, et cetera, so that you're not just thinking it's something when it might have been something else, like a mimicker. So that's probably the best way to diagnose behavioral conditions, such as depression or anxiety. I'd say for Alzheimer's disease, that's a little more difficult. I mean, patients might not even have a lot of symptoms yet if it's early onset. But there's a number of things, of course, a history and physical exam, longer taking tests such as a MoCA, a Montreal Cognitive Assessment, could be done. That typically takes, say, like 10, 15 minutes for a nurse or physician to go do. There's also some, imaging studies, of course, that could be done, but that would require a patient to go somewhere and get imaging studies to be done. There are new novel blood tests that are now out that can help diagnose Alzheimer's. These, of course, are costly, and I don't think most of them are covered by insurance. But if you did a combination of all those things, you could help to diagnose Alzheimer's disease.
What's the consequence of not being able to detect these conditions at earlier stages?
Definitely not detecting, say, depression earlier would be somewhat consequential because you could start treating depression early, right? If you diagnose it early. You could hopefully prevent someone from spiraling or getting worse, or even better, you might prevent a suicide attempt or a completed suicide attempt. Same with anxiety. You could, of course, treat patients and get them better. Alzheimer's, of course, is incurable, but there are medications that hopefully can start preventing progression of the disease. So I would say there are definitely consequences for not diagnosing either of these diseases early.
Canary Speech has developed an AI-powered vocal biomarker platform that can detect things such as changes in a person's tone, the rhythm and cadence of their speech. How does it work?
Basically, we're looking at vocal biomarkers, like you said, and we can listen to about 2,548 distinct elements of speech production every 10 milliseconds. So we only need about 45 seconds of speech to do our processing, but basically in a minute, we would have about 15 million data elements that we can collect in the speech sample. We don't analyze what you're saying, so the words don't matter to us, right? Basically, in a minute, you might say 110 words, but in that same minute, we're getting, like I said, 15 million elements. So we're really looking at how you say it. So we have machine learning models that process these signals, and then they identify the biomarkers associated with specific diseases.
It's kind of an astounding number. What are some of the other things it's actually focusing on?
In terms of different disease conditions?
Well, I no, I can think of rhythm and cadence and tone, but you said you're looking at 2,500 different points?
Yeah, so there's, say, pitch, the power of your speech, the way your vocal cords are vibrating. So these all generate, or like jitter, there's all these different kinds of vocal biomarkers that you or I may not be able to hear from our own hearing, but AI and machine learning can actually detect these.
And how were you able to actually both identify and validate these biomarkers?
So we've actually done extensive research on the conditions we're currently trying to detect. So we'll usually gather a set of data. Um, so with patients with the disease and then healthy controls. And then we basically then divide these into a training set. So about 80% of the folks from both sides, and then a test set. And then we build a model, and then we basically test it. So I guess basically Canary voice data is analyzed using a proprietary set of speech processing algorithms. And then the voice features we're talking about are extracted from the audio using signal processing, linear and nonlinear transformations. And then our machine learning technique feature selection is then used to identify a subset of the features that were there when the patient was in that state, say depression. So then that subset is used to train the machine learning model with algorithms that then use different things like linear regression or support vector machine or neural networks. And then that trained model is then how we make the predictions on, say, a new patient to see if we can detect depression or anxiety or Alzheimer's, et cetera.
Does it analyze just how something is said, or does it also consider what is said, such as word choice or syntax or the coherence of a sentence?
So we actually don't look at what is said. We're just looking at how it's said, because what is said is subjective, right? I could tell you I'm completely happy right now, except I'm completely anxious, right? Because I'm doing a podcast. So we actually look at the how, because I can't really change the how I'm saying it. It's more, it'd be difficult for me to change how my vocal cords started vibrating right now.
And to what extent do you actually understand what the system is reacting to, or does it become some sort of a black box?
So I wouldn't say it's a black box, because we're able to use AI and machine learning to detect these different kinds of vocal biomarkers. But I would say without this kind of technology, we wouldn't be able to hear it on our own.
What effects do things like age, sex, culture, ethnicity, or language, or a person's accent have on the ability to return accurate results?
That's a great question. So we actually don't think that accent or different languages, ethnicity, et cetera, would affect the vocal biomarkers. But when we've done our studies, we actually took note to look into this. So in our depression study, we actually, if you're using English as a language, we looked at patients' voice samples from every state in America. We looked in Canada, we looked in Australia, and Great Britain, so that English speakers from all over with different kinds of accents, so that we could create the model knowing or proving that actually wouldn't matter. Some of our studies, we also look at age, we look at sex. So we don't think there is, but we would never release the model without having tested it in these kind of things. We also have, validated that our models work in Japanese as well as Spanish, and we're working on new languages every day as we speak.
And how specific are the biomarkers to each condition? Does it indicate the need for additional testing, or does it provide some sort of specific diagnosis?
So our technology is what we would label a clinical decision support tool. So it does not diagnose that you have a condition, but it would lead to you to probably want to do other tests if it detected something. Um, Depending on the disease we're looking at, the specificity and sensitivity can range anywhere from the high 70s to up to 97%, let's say, for Parkinson's disease.
What's the result a physician would actually get?
So depending how they're using Canary Speech, which we could talk about, there's different ways you can use it. The most common and probably the easiest way in terms of workflow is if a physician was using an ambient listening scribe software, and we would just be an add-on on that software. So if they're using, let's say, their phone to record the conversation with the patient to write their note, Canary would also be on. And essentially, once we've gotten about 40, 45 seconds of the patient speaking, we'll send this up, of course, encrypted into the cloud. We'll process it. And within about 10 seconds or less, the physician would actually see the result on their phone. They would also see it on their note when they went back to their office to sit down to finish typing their note that was generated by the AI software for the ambient.
Would it also provide a diagnosis on the physician as well?
It could, but we have that turned off. So we use something called diarization. So we can tell if it's the physician or the patient speaking. So most places would want us only to look at the patient, right? But you can see instances where maybe looking at a physician or a nurse would be helpful because it could help us detect burnout, right, or depression or stress in our physicians community as well. But we don't do that currently, unless we were asked. We could turn it on for both sides.
Let's talk about how the system is used. My sense is it has sort of a passive screening approach, but can you explain the different situations and different ways it could be used?
Yeah. So again, the first way was what we just talked about. You're using, let's say, a ambient listening scribe to do your work in your office. Uh, Canary Speech is like an add-on extension to that. And when you're talking to the patient, Canary Speech listens, just like the ambient software listens to write your note. And then when we get enough speech, we go ahead and process it and send it back down. That's probably the most common way to use it. Another way would be through telehealth. So you and I are currently talking online, but if you're using a telehealth software, like let's say Zoom, we could be within that software and that could, again, listen to the patient talking during your telehealth visit. A third way could be we actually have a continuous ambient listening mode for to detect aggression and violence in patients in, say, hospital rooms. So our technology can also be within different types of virtual nursing technology in hospital rooms of the future, where it could be listening to a patient talking to nurses, to doctors, to the family, on the phone, and it can help detect if the patient has a higher chance of being violent towards our clinical caregivers, which, as you may know, happens often in our hospitals where people are being attacked or being verbally, attacked in the hospitals when they're trying to take care of patients. Another way would be through remote patient monitoring. Let's say a wearable device like a watch. So you could have a watch on that's listening to you talking, and it could also help monitor your disease or your progression of your disease.
And what does it take for a provider to integrate this into their systems?
So, if they're in a health system or they're in a group, if they're purchasing, say, Microsoft Dragon Copilot, which is an ambient listening scribe software, we would be within that and they could choose to have that turned on and purchase a license and use it.
Do they need to get patient consent before using it? Does someone know they're being tested, or is this something applied automatically when speaking with a clinician?
So we definitely would recommend that you would need to get consent. So just like when we're using ambient scribes to listen to patients and write our notes, we get consent for that. So if you're getting consent for that, you would probably want to get consent for Canary at the same time so that the patient knows we're using something to help detect different disease conditions through their speech.
Does it need a baseline for each patient to get a proper read on them, or is it something that's used to monitor a single person over time, or can you get an accurate read on a biomarker first time out?
No, so yeah, you wouldn't need a baseline because we've already studied it on healthy controls and those who have it. So the first time they spoke, we would already be able to help do clinical decision support for the different disease conditions we screened for.
And you mentioned this is a decision support tool as opposed to a diagnostic. What are the regulatory implications of that? Do you need to go through any kind of FDA review?
So we've spoken to the FDA, and it would be a much rigorous, more review to try to be diagnostic, but we're a clinical decision support tool, so we're already approved for that. Oh, yeah, we're also HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant. We're high trust ready, and we're ISO certified. So basically, whatever a health system might be in terms of security, we operate at the same level.
And what's the business model? Or is this software as a service?
Yeah, so it's basically B2B software as a service currently. So we're not direct to consumer.
It can be challenging to introduce new technology into clinical practice. How do you build physician acceptance with this tool, and what challenges have you faced?
Uh, I've been trying to get physicians to adopt technology for years because my previous job, I was a chief medical informatics officer. So basically, as you know, physicians are always slow to adapt any kind of technology. You've always got your laggards and people who just don't want to do anything to change whatever they've been doing. But I've kind of found if you can show that whatever technology you're asking them to use isn't going to burden them in any way, like time or a lot of clicking or anything different or learning something new, if you can show that it actually helps to benefit patient care, and if you can also show that it might actually provide a return on investment and give them more time when they go home and have less pajama time, those things backed up by rigorous data, you usually can get some adoption from your physician communities to use the technology.
I take it this is not something that's reimbursable. So what's the economic argument for providers to adopt this?
So actually, the Canary technology is reimbursable. There are a few CPT codes that can be billed for the use of the technology and screening for behavioral and cognitive conditions. But on the back end, we're not always screening. So if I'm seeing patients in my office, I'm not screening every day when I see a patient for, say, depression and anxiety, mild cognitive impairment, uh, dementia. I'm not screening all the time. Right? I don't have time. I have 15 minutes to do my visit. So I might capture HCCs earlier, right? Hierarchical condition categories. And those can, of course, increase your monthly per member per month payments, right? So if you capture some of these early, your patient is now sicker, right? So you're taking care of someone that's actually sicker, but you just didn't know. So there are actually more than one way that there could be some financial return on investment. But more importantly, again, diagnosing a patient early means you can treat them earlier, hopefully prevent them from worsening or preventing much worse.
And what's the opportunity or plan to expand the indications you can detect with this?
So we are already doing that. We have multiple sclerosis as a condition coming out probably early next year. And we're also looking at PTSD, ADHD, autism, pain. And I just came on a couple months ago. So next year, we're going to start creating a roadmap and looking at other diseases that might, definitely benefit patients. So we want to start investigating if there are vocal biomarkers for, say, lung cancer, right? It's a difficult to screen for cancer, unlike, say, breast cancer or colon cancer. So we're going to start studying lung cancer and respiratory diseases like COPD and CHF. More importantly, to see can we actually tell when a patient is getting better or worse with some of these respiratory diseases. So you could imagine like a longitudinal way of monitoring them non-invasively just by them talking.
And how's the company funded, and how far will existing cash take you?
So we're currently venture funded, led by Cortez Capital. And I'm probably not at liberty to say how far the capital will take us.
What are discussions with investors like in the current environment? And given the novelty of what you're doing, what do you think convinced your current investors to back you?
Uh, so investor interest definitely has been hot. I've actually had friends and family even asking to invest, but I think just due to our positioning in AI in the AI healthcare space, well, and AI in general has just been a hot market. We were also recently named one of Time Magazine's world's top health tech companies, so I'm sure that at least helps. Definitely doesn't hurt. Something else we've done well, I think, is we have a strong moat around our technology. So we've got 17 patents with 12 more pending. And I think this is also very attractive to our investors and also our partnerships with top enterprise companies like Microsoft and Zoom and Samsung also attracted our investors.
And without disclosing any results, have you ever applied this to the speech of public figures on TV?
I think our CEO may or may not have, but I don't know the results. It would probably work if you tried it, though.
Kang Hsu, Chief Medical Officer of Canary Speech. Kang, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.